Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. Today we are reading Reason and Justice by Richard Dien Winfield. One of the, if not frankly, the greatest Hegelian alive. Winfield has written about just about everything. Really, I mean, like when it comes to systematic philosophers, he's one of the few. He's published a ton of books. He's got a ton of articles. All of it is frankly high quality, in my opinion. I don't think he's entirely correct about everything, but goddamn, he makes a good case for what he does. He has lectures available on archive.org, I think it's called. Entire classes recorded on audio, so if you're interested, go listen to those. If not, read his books, and if not, just listen to me read these books and talk about it. But Reason and Justice is a book that is a wide-ranging, systematic critique and development of the unity of reason and justice, such that, this is the first chapter is mainly about the issues of justification, the issues of skepticism, of the inability of finding foundations of any kind, be they arbitrarily posited, metaphysically, or transcendentally. Any talks of essence, any talks of a highest being, or a simple being which is unanalyzable and unjustifiable, because it is what it is. It is the foundation of everything else, so it wouldn't have an explanation, but it is the explanation of all else. So those issues get gone on. If you're not familiar with those, I suggest you read that chapter. It's a very good chapter. But we will start in chapter 2, the metaphysics of justice, in which Winfield in chapter 1 has concluded that there's two options from the problems of skepticism and foundation. The first option is the metaphysics option. The second option is going to be the epistemic transcendental option. Either way, there's going to be problems, but the ways in which these get developed are interesting in their own right, and they have very peculiar developments. So let's get going on that. Once the metaphysical route is taken and justification is sought in the contemplation of privileged givens, it is natural for justice to be conceived by appeal to given norms that institutions and actions must embody to be legitimate. Just as the validity of knowledge would seem to lie in reasons resting upon an ultimate given foundation, so the legitimacy of conduct would seem to have its measure in standards antecedently apprehended by reason. Only by conforming to these forms of goodness, it would appear, can the will become the rational will possessing the unconditioned, universal validity that reason determines and justice enjoys. Then human conduct relinquishes its arbitrary conventions and brings into being a second nature, a good life, realizing the privileged givens in which the timeless ideal of justice resides. This attempt to realize the good life by adopting given forms of conduct defines the metaphysics of justice. In order to understand its compelling logic and final impasse, it is best to consider the basic arguments developed by the classic originators of the position, Plato and Aristotle. From the start, the metaphysics of justice is racked by tension that is both its driving force and fatal bane. The tension lies in the attempt to unite what is unconditionally universal with what is determined by independently given norms. The moment justice is conceived as the good, that unconditional universal form prescribing rationally predetermined ends and that action must achieve to be valid, legitimate conduct bears the challenge of somehow comprising actions and institutions that are for their own sakes, while all the time remaining functional in character. With just action here having ends of a given character that action must achieve to be the rational willing of justice, instrumental action, or what Plato and Aristotle call techne, becomes the paradigm of legitimate conduct. becomes the paradigm of legitimate conduct. Instead of exercising the autonomy of a free will, following its own aims, valid action embodies those predetermined functions, achieving the rationally prescribed universal goals of the good. At the same time, such conduct must be an end in itself, for if what it does is just, its activity falls within the order of justice as something to be striven for without reserve. 2.1 Plato's discovery of the basic logic of praxis theory. Haha, there you go. For you Marxists, prepare to eat your heart out, because this is really good, actually, if I remember it correctly. And this has direct links to Marx's own conception of praxis, which is, compared to this, a very poor theory. The shape of justice that immediately results from this exclusion of freedom in deference to the rule of reason is uncovered in all its firm logic by Plato in the Republic. The starting point of his metaphysics of justice is the premise that reason prescribes goals for action whose fulfillment comprises the unconditionally justified conduct, the rational willing constitutive of the good. If this teleological view be admitted, paralleling as it does the metaphysical search for true reasoning and true reality in privileged givens, then justice will require performing those functions that fulfill the goals set by reason as universally valid features of the given form of the good. Since these functions have fixed ends, they each require a corresponding expertise, disposition or character, and excellence or virtue in performance to assure their best possible completion. Therefore, if the rational goals of justice are to be best achieved, then those best qualified by expertise, character, and virtue to carry out the functions attaining these goals must perform them. The community devoted to justice will accordingly divide itself into necessary classes performing the different functions required to fulfill the rational goals of goodness, classes to which individuals will belong not by choice, but according to their capabilities to perform the requisite functions, capabilities that will differ due to varying talent, training, and attitude. Although Plato allots each individual to just one class, arguing that only such specialization ensures the best performance of each task, it is not inconceivable that the same individual could be qualified for more than one occupation and perform several without prejudicing the rationally predetermined goals of justice. Strictly speaking, individuals could thus belong to several classes at once, provided that they are fitted to carry out multiple functions with sufficient excellence. So, when the conception of the good is that we know the good as an object, a given object, and we accept that that is the given. It should be our given end in itself, for itself in this case, the good in itself. Then we have a duty. It makes sense, right? That we as human beings then would have a duty to subordinate ourselves to the accomplishing of the good, regardless of whatever other inclinations we may have. And if the realization of the good is bound by our capabilities to actually technically actualize it, then our skills is to be taken into very high account as to what we are to do, regardless of whether we would prefer to do anything else. If you're a good artist, you will be put in the class of the artists, because that's where your best realization of the good would lie in, according to your technical skills. Regardless of whether you like art or not, it's just your duty to do such a thing. And you're supposed to rationally recognize this and do it out of that duty. Be this as it may, because participating individuals must have choosing wills simply to perform their designated occupations, it cannot be guaranteed that they will automatically join the appropriate classes and properly execute the functions they are best suited to perform. Even if they understand their own aptitudes and the needs of justice, they always have the ability to choose to ignore their duties. Consequently, a further function is called for, a function consisting in the ruling activity whose purpose is limited to safeguarding the realization of justice by making sure that all the functions achieving the rational ends of goodness are performed and performed well by those individuals most fitted to do so. An additional class of individuals is therefore needed to undertake this ruling activity, a class whose members must again be selected on ability and be required to serve their posts to guarantee the best possible rule. Plato is quite right to call this class a guardian class, for its task consists in maintaining an order already determined by reason's prescription of the goals and corresponding functions of justice. So, right, given the contingencies of nature in which people may have other inclinations than to fulfill their best technical function in the state, in their societies, we need people to compel them to do so. Makes sense. On this basis, the ruling function of the guardian is a purely administrative activity of overseeing the given framework in which its own function operates. Like the action of other members of the community, the ruling action of the guardians remains an act of techne, enjoying validity only by conforming to the given norms of the good. The guardians do not decide what organization the state should have, but simply implement the class organization eternally decided by reason. In this sense, the rule of the guardians does nothing but give each individual his due, for compelling everyone to perform the class activities they do best does produce the greatest justice for all, if justice indeed consists in the fulfillment of predetermined ends. Under such a regime, all freedoms that might interfere with achieving the set goals of justice would have to be precluded. If there be any rational hierarchy of economic needs and occupations, then market freedom must be restricted to prevent individuals from both satisfying whatever needs they please through commodity exchange and entering occupations through similar agreements irrespective of the tasks mandated by reason. Most importantly, all political freedom would have to be curtailed, since neither the goals of the state, its organization, nor the assignment of its different functions could be left to the will of all or any of its members, if the order of reason is to be automatically ensured. Democracy could thus not be tolerated, for there is no telling whether the majority will choose what is rational, when rationality in politics consists of fixed ends and activities. So yeah, I mean, still makes sense as following in the necessities of this, that if the good is a given rational order, no human agency can be allowed to arbitrarily, in this case, and from the way the philosopher may see it, of choosing otherwise. Whether you want to or not, the just thing to do is the just thing to do. So just follow it, know your place, and perform your role to the best of your abilities. And there are people who are there to ensure that those with the best abilities are put in the proper roles and are doing their job. Yet can political freedom possibly be so entirely excluded? Although the guardians may be able to use their power to restrict the political, market, and even household freedom of their subjects, can the guardians' own political freedom be curtailed without eliminating their necessary position as rulers? Does not the very structure of rule transcend the limits of techne by containing an irrepressible element of freedom that gives whoever governs a sovereign will, knowing no limitation other than that which it imposes upon itself? This is a reflex problem. Who rules the rulers? Who is going to compel the rulers to rule rationally according to the good, right? Well, there's nobody above them. The good isn't going to come out into the world and punish them if they don't. So the rulers, despite maybe being aware or believing that they can only do as the good already prescribes as the given end that it is, if they so feels to do, they can choose otherwise. And who is going to do anything about it? So this is a reflex problem because in the very activity of ruling, these people are also in the process of ruling themselves. And at any time, if they become aware of this, and they so will it, they can choose to change the structures of rule. They can choose to change the structures of anything because they are the rulers. Who rules over them? Nobody. Plato, for one, addresses this problem by calling upon reason itself. He recognizes that there must be something to guarantee that the guardians do restrict their actions to achieve the goals of justice and will what is rational. His solution is to appeal to reason and require that the guardians be philosopher kings. It is not enough that they be administrators expert in the administrative science, consisting in a right opinion of the ends of justice and functions fulfilling them, all that can be apprehended without understanding why these ends should be followed. The guardians must therefore be philosophers of justice who also know the reasons justifying the ends of justice. Only then will they be compelled by the force of reason to recognize the legitimate authority of these goals. This would be a solution if knowing what justice is in its full justification were identical with doing what is just. Yet Plato himself recognizes that willing and reasoning are different activities, that the philosophers must turn away from the particular phenomena of worldly affairs when he reasons, and therefore that the philosopher must be compelled to rule. But who will compel philosophers to rule or guardians to philosophize when it is precisely the apex of command that must be rational? To be founders of the just state in speech or in deed guarantees nothing once the rulers are in place, lording over all others as well as over themselves. So this is the old issue that is knowledge itself compelling on the will to be good? Does knowing the good in any way have the consequence of making you good? Plato recognizes this problem, and so does Socrates. Now, Socrates thinks that knowing and willing should be one, but the argument that he has for that is at best weak, and at worst just simply not convincing because it cannot provide a complete account that justifies it. My personal view is that it is like that there is an identity between knowing and willing, but it has to be a true knowing, and it has to be a true knowing on a level that you really do know that it's true. It's not a mere belief, because you can believe true things without having any conviction in them. But when you know a truth, that truth is constitutive of you, and so you also have the emotions tied to that, the will towards that truth. But this only happens at a very, very high level of a knowledge of a truth. And sometimes the concept is too abstract for one to have the proper knowledge of what a thing really is. Such that one does not understand the concrete rationality because one does not have the experience, just the same as with concepts. If you do not actually think a concept and you only think about it formally, you're not compelled to really accept that concept as a truth, as the concept that it is. But if you actually carry out the cognitive exercise, that activity, which constitutes and determines that concept, it's unquestionable. There's no way you're going to fool yourself that that is not the case. And of course, if you value truth, and if you really grasp that, that's going to have an emotional effect on you. You're going to be convinced. You're going to have a conviction in that. And falsehood is going to cause a reaction in you. You cannot really be indifferent on that level. But anyways, that's a long aside. Any of you have thoughts on that, or?
Not much, no. I mean, yeah, but I don't want to go off on that tear.
No, yeah, that's fine.
Not too much to say at the moment either.
Plato's considered attempt to secure the rational willing of justice by excluding freedom here collapses in face of the seeming bond between freedom and political rule. Although he seeks to conceive the just state as the embodiment of given forms of conduct antecedently apprehensible by the rulers imposing them, the structure of political dominion leaves justice to contend with a self-determining activity of rule imposing order upon the order of which it is part. This sovereign activity of the guardians cannot be contained within the instrumental framework of techne, where action, be it ruling or servile, has legitimacy by embodying prescribed modes of conduct. To the extent that ruling is a reflexive activity determining the order of which it is the commanding element, it is not a passive material awaiting the imposition of given form as in the paradigm of instrumental action. Rather, ruling seems to comprise a self-informing activity that has neither form nor matter prior to its own action upon itself and the order it governs. Although the individuals who rule must each have a given body, mind, and will in order to govern, their specific being as rulers would seem to coevally determined by their own to be coevally determined by their own governing. Indeed, it will appear that whatever authority is sovereign within the state not only determines the policies it executes, but the very form of government in which it operates, including the character of its own ruling agency. Indeed, right? That any state has to will and decide for itself that it is the state that it is. Regardless of who it is that's founding it, whether it is the people or a tyrant or whatever. It's not a given thing. Even if they may claim it's a given thing, they are ultimately deciding to impose that form on themselves and on others. And they can't escape that responsibility.
Right. And it's not simple authoritarianism. I mean, it is authoritarian, but it's not an unnecessary imposition like we would think of a totalitarian state in normal terms. There is a character that is the embodiment of what the state wills, or at least the rulers will. And at least for Plato or Hegel, if you don't like that state and what it wills, then you ought to move to another place or whatever.
That concerns the specific relative determinacies of states in relationship to each other.
Yeah.
But I think that the main issue here that's being brought up is that regardless of what the rulers may say about why they are ruling, and the claim that they are compelled to rule in that way, and that they are compelled to order the state in that way, Ultimately, the reality is that their agency is right smack in the middle of the determination of that. And here there's no account as to how that self-ruling agency is supposed to work and how it can work.
Yeah.
Admittedly, this by no means makes the sovereign activity of rule self-evidently legitimate. Nonetheless, it does suggest that the conception of praxis, of action that embodies given form, yet enjoys the validity of being for its own sake, cannot provide for justice without going beyond its own limits and subverting the whole framework of given prescribed norms on which it rests. What lays bare the full dilemma of the metaphysics of justice is Aristotle's concerted effort to salvage the legitimacy of praxis by remedying the problems afflicting Plato's argument. Right, so to recap that, what he says, praxis is action that embodies a given form. If the relationship of humans to the highest principle, the good, is praxis, then the good is the given form towards which all action conforms. So therefore, we all must act towards the good. Each, the state is a differentiated entity in which various things ought to be done necessarily. People, therefore, are split into classes according to their technical capacities, their techne. Rulers themselves are also a part of that, but they're a specific part in which they are the rulers of the other parts that ensure their proper ordering and activity. Because the other parts cannot be expected to, of their own account, be capable of self-rule. And these are the philosopher kings, because the philosopher kings don't have other people above them, but instead have the good above them as such, which is reason. And because they are philosopher kings, they love wisdom, they love truth, they love the good, and that love also, therefore, compels them to obey reason. And therefore they structure the state and order things according to the good and rationality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very specifically a top-down structure.
Yes, and then the subversion of this, where this ultimately falls apart, is the fact that the good being given is just a given. It has no further justification. And for the rulers, the knowledge of the good may not be enough to bend their will towards the good and wanting to do the good. So therefore they have to decide to go with the good for rational and arbitrary reasons alike. But it's their choice, and that choice is a real choice. Therefore that gap between the certainty of the good and the reality of it can never be filled in this system. That gap is forever left open. The system cannot close. And that element of a self-reflexive freedom in which the rulers actively decide to rule themselves in certain ways and rule others along with them is ineliminable. So they cannot actually be practically engaging in praxis, because ultimately the final arbiter of whether they will or will not follow the good is entirely in them seeing the rationality of the good and choosing to go with it, or maybe not believing that the good is really the rational and deciding to go against it. For whatever reasons, they might be arbitrary. In this case, we don't yet have any particular reasons for go one way or the other at that point. The point is, though, that reflexivity moment is there, and this, if this not being accounted for, breaks the circularity of the system and allows for its necessary disintegration or overcoming. 2.2 Aristotle's Politics and Internal Collapse of Praxis Theory. Accepting the defining framework of praxis, where justice is the realization of the predetermined good through virtue, character, and rational rule, Aristotle aims his ethical investigations at uncovering what is necessary to ensure that the good is actually willed. Well aware of Plato's difficulties, Aristotle recognizes that knowledge of the good does not equal performance of good deeds. Habit, not knowledge, is the mother of virtue because it can train the will as knowledge never can. So too, the role of agreement and consent in political power must be paid heed, even if the best should rule. No matter how strongly reason argues in their favor, they can never get the chance to govern unless the many grant them the opportunity. Further provision for the material prerequisites of the good life cannot be neglected. The good and the shadow of relativism. Conscious of these issues, Aristotle pushes the logic of metaphysics of justice to the limit of its internal collapse. His starting point has all the compelling lure that the metaphysics of justice should possess, given the classic stature it has since come to command. Since justice concerns the domain of choice, where individuals voluntarily act to fulfill consciously represented goals, it is only natural to locate normative validity in the character of the chosen end. As in the search for reasons to justify knowledge claims, only an unconditioned principle could transform opinion into truth. So here, with regard to conduct, only an end that is for its own sake can provide ultimate justification for action. Any goal that is not an end in itself, but merely a means serving something else, is only as valid as that to which it is subordinate. Consequently, the justice of any action must ultimately lie in the end that comes first as fully independent and self-sufficient aim. The good must thus be an end in itself, prescribing a goal for conduct that is for its own sake. Yet the good does not possess the unconditioned universality justice requires simply by being something for its own sake. By itself, this quality of being an end in itself leaves room for a plurality of goods, wherein any aim counts as right provided it is pursued for no other reason than its own fulfillment. To prevent this fall into total relativism, the good, the legitimate aim of valid conduct, must be both an end in itself and the final end to which all others are subordinated. Then it will be the one exclusive first principle of all conduct. Under the sway of its privileged givenness, actions directed upon other goals will have validity only to the degree that the fulfillment of their chosen aims contributes to the realization of this supreme aim, which alone deserves to be sought unconditionally. It is this recourse to an ultimate given end ruling over all else. If this recourse to an ultimate given end ruling over all else seems to secure justification by providing an exclusive norm limiting relativism, the content of this good still remains virtually undetermined. Indeed, if all that can be said is that it is the first principle and final end of all action, the good seems to have no fixed content at all. Any ruling authority that succeeds in subordinating all actions to its governing aim would count as valid no matter what its aim might be. A radical evil pursued for its own sake by those in power would here be completely indistinguishable from any putative good. Unless further qualifications can be supplied, the argument for the primacy of the good would be equivalent to the doctrine that might makes right, where whatever is all-powerful is valid in virtue of being the final ruling end of action. Alright, so far this makes sense in that the good is just defined as that which is for its own sake, but it has no further specifications. So anything that's done for its own sake would fit the bill, and therefore there are many goods, and some goods are going to be more worldly efficacious than others. What lies at issue is once again that perennial problem of metaphysics, the problem of justifying the privilege given in which ultimate justification is vested. It may be natural to root justice in some good serving as the final end of action, but further argument must be supplied to determine what exactly it comprises. Aristotle does proceed to tackle this problem, but in so doing, he reveals just how insoluble the problem is. In moving to concretize the good and remove the relativity that still remains, Aristotle is logically compelled to to characterize the good as a form of activity whose unconditioned validity challenges the instrumentality of techne that is equally bound up with praxis. What Aristotle realizes is that if the end of action is an end in itself that is equally a final end ruling over all others, it cannot be a product of action akin to an artifact produced by technical activity. An artifact cannot be an end in itself because a product is relative to its production, being conditioned by that antecedent act giving it its form. A product is thus not a privileged given, but rather a determined content issuing from a prior determiner. Further, an artifact does not subordinate action to itself as the good should do. It rather remains an entity more subject to than master of action. Finally, the action realizing the good is itself unconditionally valid, such that instead of being a mere means to an end, it shares in the justice whose work it is. So if the good is the unconditioned, we cannot go with it in the form that Plato put it forth as a given end of techne, because then the good is only the good insofar as it is the result of techne. The techne conditions it. But Aristotle realizes that if the end of action is an end in itself that is equally a final end ruling over all others, it cannot be a product of action akin to an artifact produced by technical activity. An artifact cannot be an end in itself because a product is relative to its production, being conditioned by that antecedent act giving it its form. A product is thus not a privileged given, but rather a determined content issuing from a prior determiner. Further, an artifact does not subordinate action to itself as the good should do. It rather remains an entity more subject to than master of action. Finally, the action realizing the good is itself unconditionally valid, such that instead of being a mere means to an end, it shares in the justice whose work it is. So okay, that makes sense to me as why the good must be an activity, because activities determine that which they act upon. So then the relationship with the good cannot be that of an artifact, that which is the end, a crafted end to an activity, because then it's determined by that activity. That activity is the determining principle that conditions that end. Without that activity, the end is not what it is, it does not exist, blah blah blah. But if the activity itself is the end, the action realizing the good is itself unconditionally valid, such that instead of being a mere means to an end, it shares in the justice whose work it is. Okay, makes sense to me. All this suggests that the privileged end of action, which is alone an end in itself, is not a product of action, but a form of activity. There we go. Reflex, the activity that acts upon itself. Namely, the goal of justice is none other than just action, or in other words, the good is the good life. That is good. I have to say, like, Winfield is masterful at distilling these arguments to such a rational core of essence. You can tell he's thought about this shit for a long time. Given the already established features of the good, the activity in which it consists must be none other than action that is both for its own sake and the ruling aim of other activities. If, following Aristotle, we call such valid conduct praxis, then praxis signifies a non-instrumental activity that lords over all instrumental action, giving the latter the only end that it should unconditionally serve. Praxis as a sole activity for its own sake thus subordinates instrumental action to itself, granting instrumental action as a secondary validity to the extent that the latter provides the conditions allowing praxis to be conducted. So, I think we've got all the pieces here just to see what's coming up, right? We're like,
Yeah.
there's going to be a practice or an activity which is the product of activity, which itself is going to produce that producing activity as its own consequence and condition. This is virtue. And this version of praxis is what I think Marx can aim at as his highest understanding of praxis. The highest he can conceptualize would be this. You know, it's like labor is praxis. The purpose of labor is to produce, you know, the general creativity of labor, which reflexes back on itself in producing also the through that labor the very society which gives it the conditions of pursuing that activity of specific labors. So the labor of the labor of ruling arises from creative labors and other kinds of labors. So it's one giant circle of praxis. It's absolute praxis. These features should leave little doubt as to why Aristotle concludes that praxis is political in character. What else but politics could comprise that special activity conducted for its own sake, independently of any higher authority, ruling over all other practical affairs, subordinating them to its own pursuits, and thereby affording them a legitimate purpose? If praxis is valid conduct, then the good life must be the life of the citizen, and the good life and the good must have for its total reality the just state. To the activity of producing other activity. Yeah. Yet granted that the good has the added character of being the political activity comprising the just state, it still remains to be determined what precisely is the content of that institution in the good life of the citizen who animates it. What makes this question particularly acute are the terms under which it must be answered. In light of the metaphysical approach to justification, the content of the good must still reside in some privilege given comprising the proper nature of justice. Since the second nature prescribes the rationally apprehensible norm to which action and institutions should conform, the latter have their validity by embodying that antecedent form. Although what takes on that form are action in its institutional framework, rather than an artifact produced as a result of a prior act, the givenness of the good still poses a problem for the new character that political action assumes once it is recognized to be an end in itself. The basic problem of praxis comes down to this. Can just action be for its own sake, ruling over all other activity, and still be the embodiment of independently given form? In attempting to conceive the valid content of politics, Aristotle addresses this question and gives it a positive response. On all levels, praxis is to combine both features at once. So, just action will be for its own sake, ruling over all other activity, and still be the embodiment of independently given form. So on all levels, praxis to combine both features. So on all levels, political and sub-political and virtue, for example, it will be both an embodiment of independently given form, but also a determining action over something else. At the level of ethics, where valid conduct is determined in general, independently of the specific political roles distinguishing citizens from one another, the parameters of action do indeed prescribe conduct that is both for its own sake and an embodiment of given determinacy. The particular content of action is not created by some autonomous act of will, but provided by the mean of conduct, whose determinacy is found at hand, contextually defined, and ready to be followed. Virtue, comprising the excellence in the performance of the mean, is thus stamped with givenness as well, for it is mandated by the function the mean prescribes. Consequently, virtues are each rooted in character, providing the given disposition from which their fixed excellence most naturally proceeds. For those not familiar with Aristotle's virtue, the mean is the point of a continuum of action between between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of lack. There's weird things like the virtue of eating properly, which is don't eat too much because then you're a glutton, but don't eat too little because then you are slowly starving yourself. The virtuous thing is just to eat enough to satisfy the needs of your body and be in good shape. Another one would be the virtue of being fit. Work out so that you look like a toned man or woman, some good muscles, figure. But maybe don't exercise to excess where you look like a deformed freak like Arnold Schwarzenegger at his peak. A hulking meathead. But also don't not work out because then you look like a skinny wimp, and you're not living up to the beautiful standards which your body could be at its peak performance. Both lifting too many weights is a vice, and not lifting weights at all is definitely a vice. You got to be somewhere in the middle. So, and these, by the way, are actual examples that people come up with, because the virtue principle can be applied to just about everything. It's not just the so-called cardinal virtues that we hear about in Christianity. So virtue has a given embodied determinacy, and the form of virtue, it's always the mean, is given. And then the activity of virtue determines over the specific choices of things that one is supposed to do. So it is determined, but also determining. Yet despite their stamp of given determinacy character, virtue and the mean of conduct are still elements of conscious deliberative action. They cannot contribute to the good without an intervening deliberation to choose the proper means to realize the prescribed end that conduct ought to achieve. Since this deliberation must take into account the particular situation in which action is contemplated, it must rely on perception with all its subjective limitations to grasp the present predicament, and that employ discretion to determine how the universal aim of justice can be applied to the here and now of individual conduct. As Aristotle is famously aware, this judgment is not scientific, grasping what is necessarily true with the full autonomy of thought. It is rather a prudential decision, contextually bound by all the givens that determine both the situation at hand and the privileged aim to be realized. Nevertheless, the result of the deliberation must still somehow be an act for its own sake, and not simply an act serving as a means to a given end. By itself, the general structure of ethics, that is, of action taken in abstraction from the specific rules of citizenship, offers little to account for how this is possible. Already the requirement that the good comprise an activity that is an end in itself, ruling over all other pursuits, indicates that the ethics of praxis is really inseparable from politics. Consequently, if there is to be any account of an action for its own sake and proceed from choice, it must lie in the analysis of the master activity in which political association consists. So I think on the issue of, okay, you're given the rule of virtue, But then what do you do with that? And you say, well, I just look at the situation, right? And I should choose the mean. But what is the situation? What virtue should you be looking to employ, right? In a life and death scenario, for example, should you be looking out for the virtue of courageousness? Should you be looking out for the virtue of righteousness? Should you be looking out for the virtue of how fit you are? Some of these things are very obvious. Okay, this doesn't apply, but in a lot of other things, it's not obvious. What is the virtuous thing to do? Because it's not easy to determine what the actual condition, the situation, really calls for. I don't know. That makes sense to me. How about you guys?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And the problem is important too. Many different things can be considered virtuous. We're uncertain of how to know which ones to apply in a given specific circumstance and scenario. What's the adjudicator? We need, and also, the universal of the good. How do I know which procedure is the preferable one, which virtue is the best? Even if I do know which virtues are applicable to the situation, how do I know the best one? Best follows the good.
Yep. I expected you to say, why, of course, Socrates. I appear.
No, I was going to say, by Zeus, in all things, moderation, Socrates.
All right. The praxis of politics and the appeal to nature. At the outset of the turn, to politics, TwoBody Questions light the way. Justice may well involve action for its own sake that subordinates all other affairs to its own, but this alone does not seem sufficient to distinguish justice from any conventional political power. On the other hand, the problem of justification may indeed suggest that justice consists in the realization of a privileged end antecedently prescribed by reason. But how can the second nature of such a good be distinguished from the givenness of operative practice, or the normative neutral nature given independently of voluntary action? Let me read the second one. On the other hand, the problem of justification may indeed suggest that justice consists in the realization of a privileged end antecedently prescribed by reason. But how can the second nature of such a good be distinguished from the givenness of operative practice, or the normatively neutral nature given independently of voluntary action? I would assume that this would have to then provide the theory of justification or the theory of reason itself, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Because the praxis theory's metaphysical commitment to privileged givens, all it can do in its attempt to salvage justice is move back and forth from one aspect to the other, bringing in further natural features to distinguish action for its own sake from conventional might, while appealing to the self-sufficient independence of action for its own sake to distinguish the nature of justice from those givens of convention and nature, having no privileged authority for ethics. Thus, when Aristotle opens his Politics with an investigation of the origin of the state, it is to concretize the ruling subordinating quality of political action while establishing its special natural character. Both sides have a twofold character that is by no means accidental. The genesis of the state and the relation between politics and non-political associations. In discussing how the state arises from the household and village society in Book 1 of his Politics, Aristotle depicts non-political associations that are preconditions of political life, as well as institutions incorporated within the state as subordinate elements. As preconditions, the household and village society can and do exist prior to the state, so that it is possible to speak of the state arising out of them. Insofar as they are distinguished from the proper political activity of praxis, the household and village do not exist on their own for the ethical concerns of the good life. By themselves, they instead provide for the necessities of bare life and its procreation, and for luxuries of comfortable living that the market of village society provides. For this very reason, they can certainly exist without a political domain encompassing them. However, to the extent that neither life itself nor comfortable living are ends in themselves, household and village association have no normative validity until they do become incorporated within a political community where they can serve as prerequisite means for the good life, freeing citizens from the struggle for survival, furnishing the state a surplus of social wealth, allowing political institutions to be financed. So there we go. The elements of the state, or the parts of the state, may pre-exist the state, but independent of the state, these parts have no no normative validity. They don't tell us how to live the good life until they do become incorporated within the political community. Because then these are just natural determinations. We just naturally have families. And this is not talking about some high concept of families, just talking about the natural fact of parents raising children in households, living in villages. Still with the pursuit of goodness. Yeah, good.
No,
still, still with the pursuit of goodness consists in the life of the citizen, within an existing body politic rather than in the constituting act whereby a state is founded, the genesis of the state can no more be rooted in political action than in activity directed to political goals. It is thus reasonable to presume that the just state must be capable of arising from pre-political associations on their own terms. The grounds for this are not hard to find. Since neither household nor village societies can protect their own pursuit of life and comfort without a higher authority to adjudicate internal disputes and defend against external enemies, political organization could be said to emerge imminently from the concerns of pre-political institutions. In other words, to paraphrase Aristotle, the state comes into being for the sake of existence, the existence of life and convenience. Yet once emergent, the state immediately transcends these concerns by being a sovereign domain existing for the sake of its own good life of citizenship. Supreme unto itself, it incorporates under its sway the household and village society, granting them legitimacy as contributing conditions for the good life. Pretty good. Now, here there's no account for the justification of why the state is justified in having its own normative domain above the immediacy of these villages and households. But for Hegel, there is a justification for that as being the condition for the possibility of those institutions being able to exist. What he says here, that the state arises for the sake of existence of these pre-political institutions. That is certainly a part of the historical moment, which is the case.
Because it's a necessary condition for establishing the community of conscious life that is the justified end of just simple political or religious community. You have that as a necessary moment in the development of that spiritual legacy that is to come to be.
Yeah, and then in Hegel's system of this, the state gets to have its own particular sphere because its reality is beyond the village and family, and it has its own concerns to deal with, particularly as the form of reality that it is. Politics doesn't arise willy-nilly because people just randomly decide that it will do so. Politics rises out of the necessity to deal with those new political realities, and then this takes a life of its own, simply because the questions of the state are not the questions of your literal life and block of block village. The state has to concern itself with questions of what is justice, what is going to be law. It has to decide what are going to be the rights of the people in it, even if it does not state them in terms of rights. All these things, and these things are not things that your family is going to be dealing with internally as a family. It's not going to be the thing that your church is going to be dealing with internally to itself as a church. These are things specific to the state. The state has its own life, and those necessities of that existence obviously then apply downward to us as conditions in which our own realities are existent, and which in the best way will actually increase our capacity to self-determine as opposed to enslave us. And now most people look at the empirical state and say, the state is just this enslaving machine. Libertarians see that. I think unfortunately Marxists see it that way. That it's a tool of oppression. They don't see it as something enabling. But they don't think about even these simple things, that the state exists because you need these determinate social realities which other people recognize and abide by, and can be enforced if other people decide to violate them.
It's like Zizek said, living with the state is difficult. Living without the state is even more difficult.
Yes, imagine if you're Russia. Today you're a Russian. If the Russian state it does not exist, the U.S. can go and steamroll, and the U.S. is not going to care about you as a Russian citizen. Oh, you're not going to be a citizen of Russia because Russia is going to cease to exist.
Yeah, there's no sovereignty there.
You're going to be you're going to have a country ruling over you whose interest is not your interest. And that's just a fact. And, as bad as Putin may be, as bad as the Russian government and corruption may be, at least Putin has some definite ties to the interest of Russia as a whole.
Yeah, the polity, and they may not fully see themselves embodied within Putin's regime government, but they see far more of themselves in that government, which was Dugin's point of allying with Putin. Not to get political, but than they would if the U.S. just imposed its will upon them.
Yeah, because as bad as Russia is, if the U.S. got its way, it would be much worse. Guaranteed. I tell you this from a personal background and experience.
But not just that; it would be, an imposed character upon them, an imposed will that is not their own, and that would have to conform to it or reject it, in battle, whatever.
Yep.
Which I find more of a claim against it than just pure domination, even though that's wrong. It's worse to, deny a people their will, I guess, even if it's an abstract will, not fully developed. They have no hope of developing into what they might have been. Anyway.
Yeah, if you think the state is bad, just look at the Congo.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not the peoples of the Congo's fault that they have no state. The rest of the world has massively fucked with them.
Those guerrillas need to incorporate.
So this dual relation between pre-political and political associations does therefore concretize the meaning of action for its own sake by indicating how praxis must involve a definite institutional connection between politics and the affairs of household and society. At the same time, it determines the natural character the just state enjoys as the embodiment of privileged givens. Insofar as the relation between politics and pre-political association is dual in character, so is the given nature of the state. On the one hand, the state is natural, because as Aristotle notes, it arises from other natural associations. Indeed, insofar as the state arises from pre-existing households and village societies, it can be said to have a natural character, signifying how political association rests upon foundations with natures of their own given independently and prior to it. However, the nature of these antecedent institutions is ambiguous. If it refers to their pre-existing given character, the natural character the state obtains by issuing from them has no normative privilege, for all it refers to are ethically neutral foundations of life and comfort. If, on the other hand, it refers to their legitimate character as means of good living incorporated as material elements of an existing state, the nature of household and village society is actually not given, but posited by the ruling activity that shapes and secures their valid role. Right, so ambiguities there about nature. So, insofar as the state arises from natural families and villages, the natural character of families and villages have no normative value to the state, or have no normative determination upon it. But insofar as families and villages are normative in being parts of the determination of the good life, their natural character is ignored. The family in the village becomes a moment, a part, or a means for the state to realize its own end, which is the good life as the political life, the life of the citizen.
Which is directly opposed to nature by willing.
Yep. In this regard, the state is natural in the very different sense of being the telos, or final end of all non-political associations. Although temporally subsequent to household and villages, the state is prior by nature, to the extent that the latter signifies not the nature consisting in what is antecedently given existence, but the nature commanding normative validity as the privileged given end to which all else should be subordinate. So, rational nature.
Yeah, go back up. I need to reread the first sentence you highlighted. Because I didn't get it. I didn't get if it was like a natural, what it meant by natural.
I think natural as in the nature concept, the rational nature.
I didn't know if he meant a sequitur or what. Yeah. Alright, that's fine.
That the state is the telos of non-political institutions, such as the natural character of household and village society, as relative to the privileged nature of politics, introduces a type of unity that is hardly identical to the natural unity exemplified by an organism. Whereas all parts of an organism reciprocally condition one another, without any one having a privileged role in securing the unity of the whole, the relation of state to household and village society is entirely different. By governing them for the sake of maintaining its own activity of political rule, the state achieves a self-sufficiency based on a very non-reciprocal relation between political institutions and the non-political associations underlying them. This self-sufficiency is not the same as self-creation, for the state can arise only by incorporating pre-existing households and social institutions. Nevertheless, since the state makes these its subservient organs the moment it incorporates them, they lose their character as independent conditions that might determine the nature of what they condition. Instead, they become elements of a regime whose determining political power is not defined by any household or social ends, but rather rules over their organization, securing their normatively valid nature while aiming at nothing but the perpetuation of its own special political activity. Only by exhibiting this unconditioned self-sufficiency can politics rest on non-political associations without forfeiting its privileged character as an exclusive end in itself, coming first by nature. So, here comes the the state as the end of all things, exclusively, so that whatever goes on in the life of the state, it has to be towards the end of the state, and the state's goal is to pursue and perpetuate that.
There's a weird misplaced comma that made me read it wrong the first time.
I skipped something.
The way the page ended was funny because it sounded like the state aiming at nothing.
Yeah. Through this type of hegemony, it appears that the natural character of the state perfectly coincides with its character as an exclusive end in itself. Yet this coincidence is more a sign of an abiding formality than a token of an achieved resolution of the problem of justice. The subordination of household and society to politics might be an aspect of justice, but by itself it neither ensures that all states achieving that subordination are just, nor what organization a just state should have. The mere hegemony of the state over family and social affairs can be no substitute for what qualifies a political order as the reality of the good. So we still have a very indeterminate concept of the state at this point. The state ought to be the good in itself is the good life, which is the political life of the citizen. Therefore, the state is the executor of the good. The activity is political activity. Though it arises from natural, or originally natural as in externally given parts in the family and village, nonetheless, once a state arises, it overdetermines the family and village as means to its own ends. But still, we have no notion as to what the specificity of those ends actually are.
Yeah, it's just an abstract association at this point. Will we ever get beyond it? That remains to be seen.
So far, we've got the natural necessity of the state, as well as the asymmetrical character, or self-determining character of the state, and politics as a absolute power over the rest of the spheres of life. But we don't have a distinction between the justified state, the good state, and despotism, or just what is by happenstance hegemonic, rather than a good state.
So again, the metaphysics of justice must provide some further position to the privileged givenness of the good to secure its legitimacy, and once again Aristotle pushes forward the metaphysical approach in search of an answer. The constitution of the state and the privileged givenness. It is no accident that neither Aristotle's account of the origin of the state nor his conception of the relation between politics and the affairs of household and society can provide the nature of justice. The origin of the state cannot supply it with its valid nature, simply because if the state is for its own sake, its nature must lie in itself and not in any antecedent source. Therefore, if the legitimacy of politics as activity that is an exclusive end in itself still lies in privileged prescribed nature, that nature is coeval with the actuality rather than the genesis of the state. What does that word mean, by the way? It's coeval.
That's like co-primordial, co-occurring. They happen at the same time or in tandem.
Yeah, contemporary.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, I'm replying to somebody.
That's fine. Similarly, the justice of the good cannot be located in the relation between the state and non-political institutions, if the only valid purpose of politics is realizing its own ruling activity. The legitimate nature of the state must rather lie within itself. Consequently, the quest for the justice of praxis must turn to the political constitution in search of the added features to render action for its own sake normatively valid. The basic starting point for determining the state's constitution would seemingly lie in its most basic element, the citizen. Yet since politics is for its own sake and the constitution specifies its abiding internal order, the nature of the citizen would not be something prior to the state, but rather something relative to the constitution. And here he's not talking about constitution as in the constitution, like a written constitution of the state. He's talking the constitution as in the determinate specified character of the parts of the state. Just like, your body is constituted of your various organs, your limbs, your bones, nervous system, and so on and so on. The state is constituted by the citizen, laws, procedures, ethics, so on and so on. By itself, this insight could be taken as a merely descriptive observation insofar as constitutions arising through convention can take various forms. However, if it is understood against the background of the previous specifications of the good, it does entail two normative prescriptions. First, it prescribes that no pre-political factors should determine citizenship. Only what is relevant to participating in political association and achieving a specific purpose should count, given the primacy of politics. Secondly, if the Constitution has a privileged nature distinct from the givenness of what simply exists, then citizenship equally possesses a nature distinct from the given forms of citizenship that convention historically imposes. So citizenship ain't natural. Just being born doesn't make you a citizen. Although who is a citizen by convention will vary for each kind of constitution, who the citizen should be by nature can thus only be determined in reference to the constitution that is itself best by nature. Aristotle may define the citizen to be he who shares in administering justice and holding office, but the normative character of this role remains unspecified until the content of the just state is defined in its own right. For this to be done, the valid nature of the constitution must be uncovered. Aristotle is quick to grasp the only alternative offered by the metaphysics of justice. Like the nature of praxis in general, that of the constitution has two faces. First, with respect to mere existence, a constitution is by nature determined by who is sovereign. Since every state must be ruled by one, the few or the many, constitutions must exhibit a corresponding threefold division. Yet such a division cannot determine what the constitution should be. By itself, the question of who governs has nothing of the state's goodness. If justice lies in realizing some privileged given form of conduct instead of in allowing a certain will or group of wills free sway, any of these three forms of rule might or might not be directed at the proper ends antecedently prescribed by reason. Accordingly, there must be a further division of constitutions, taking into account this normative dimension. Once due heed is paid to the privileged nature that the just constitution requires, the threefold division of constitutions becomes doubled into a distinction between three legitimate and three perverted constitutions. As Aristotle rigorously points out, what differentiates them is naturally whether the one, the few, or the many who rule do so for the common good or for a separate end of their own. In this way, monarchy, aristocracy, and polity comprise rule by one, the few, and the many for the common good, whereas tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy stand condemned as the illegitimate perversions of these forms. Needless to say, such a distinction between legitimate and perverted constitutions has no significance for determining the privileged givenness of justice unless the common good can be further specified. Monarchy could not be distinguished from tyranny, any more than aristocracy from oligarchy, or finally polity from democracy, if the ruler in each legitimate constitution were sovereign. In order for the good to be the firm end of their governing, these rulers must be bound by law to realize that privileged aim, for only a supreme law's impersonal universal rule can guard against the arbitrariness of each and every will. Of course, as Aristotle fully recognizes, such law cannot be positive law issuing from a legislator invested with independent legal authority. In that case, the lawmaker, rather than the law, would be sovereign, leaving the pursuit of justice a matter of choice. Law may have a legal form, and such that it may be posited to have effect, such that it must be posited to have effect. Yet if law is sovereign, legislators only discover and declare what the law is by nature. Excuse me. Rather than exercising some privileged power of making law whatever they will. Since the justice of praxis lies in privileged givenness and not in the acts of a privileged determiner, the essence of law should lie not in how and by whom it is enacted as a work of convention, but in the fixed content it prescribes as an impersonal rule of state. Now that's an interesting argument, in my opinion. It's a way of trying to escape the arbitrariness of the individuality, right? If this signifies that the supreme law of the Constitution is a law whose content is naturally given, it does not mean that the required law can be simply any given unalterable one. If justice is something other than arbitrary custom, the law in question must be a natural law whose nature has the privilege of being the one given body of rules possessing normative validity, aka the Constitution as the highest law of the land. This is not to say that the metaphysics of justice rules out any role to positive law. As Aristotle observes, although the fundamental natural features of justice can be specified by an unchanging law, other matters, such as the length of prison terms, are inherently changeable and relative to given situation. If such affairs are to be decided in an impersonal way for the common good, then a law is called for which is local and changing. This then allows for two types of legislators: those declaring the immutable constitutional principles in which goodness lies, and those making positive laws of local application.
Positive law. Is that like written law?
I would say it's just, law that's laid down. Since it's a relative law, it's just based on whatever the convention happens to be. What would that be like? It's like people talk about like common law, in which like the law just happens to be whatever the history of the judges in that jurisdiction happen to have done, and how other judges like go off by that kind of case law. Right, I think that I mean, it's law that has no ultimate rational justification. Like it is relative to the conditions of the time, and what people happen to think is rational for that, even if it's not absolutely rational.
Right, yeah. For the Wikipedia, and this sounds like it's in line with what we've been reading. It's the concept of positive law is distinct from natural law, which comprises inherent rights conferred not by the act of legislation, but by God, nature, or reason. So natural law is absolute, again, immutable, as he said. And then positive law involves peculiar, local, parochial, specific norms.
Yep. All right, continuing. Similarly, as much as authority rests on the fixed principles of justice, the universal content of law leaves undecided how it should be applied in every individual case. Thus, equity is needed as a further act of discretion to apply the law to particular situations, just as practical deliberation must enter into every act of praxis to determine how to embody the given means of conduct. There we go, the gap is appearing again. So, we may have the given law, but the question of how to apply it, when to apply it, to what extent to apply it, remains a subjective deliberation. With all these features in hand, it well seems that the metaphysics of justice is on the verge of finding its prey, especially once it is recognized how law, in the special sense of privileged natural law, entails several more consequences for politics. First, since law, unlike decree, refers to legal subjects rather than particular individuals, it renders citizens equal in regard to its jurisdiction. Thus, if the law is sovereign in a just state, the politics can be called an association of equals. However, if what citizens are equal before is a law prescribing virtues rather than rights, their equality is a proportionate one, where equal merit is equally rewarded by allotment of those functions best fulfilled by those who are most virtuous. This must be the case in the politics of praxis, for here what is legitimate is not the respected exercise of freedom, but the embodiment of fixed forms of good. If the law is sovereign and prescribes an equality by merit, it is similarly natural for the just constitution to allow for rulers and ruled to alternate. To maintain its impersonality and the given primacy of its mandated ends, the law must not be the special charge of any individuals other than those who qualify according to the law itself. Therefore, rulers can be permitted to retain power only so long as no better ones are found among the other citizens. Let me tell you, living in the US, I'm down for that. I'm totally down for that. I am against term limits. Because term limits, that's a whole myth about, but it's about protecting democracy. No, it isn't.
Nope.
It's about parties who are afraid that there will be someone who's so popular that they won't get into power for as long as that person lives. That's the fear. It's not a fear.
They're good.
Yeah, whether or not they're good.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was just that he were, a 4-term president. Or was. They were because he didn't complete his 4th term, but it was just that he was elected the 4th term.
Term limits also prevent long-term thinking in politics.
Yeah. That's a problem I have with America. I mean, not to get on that tangent, but there is no, obvious political project, or, there's no constant leadership. There's nothing that can be pointed toward, like, if we get into power, then we're going to, try to start wars with Russia. Well, if we get into power, we're going to start war with China. It's incomprehensible.
The Indian state of Sikkim has had the same prime minister for, I think, or governor for 20 years. And over that 20 years, he managed to transition the entire state from more industrial style agriculture to organic agriculture, while maintaining economic strength. And that was a long-term project that wouldn't have been doable without the capacity for him to stay in power for 20 years.
Right.
I think he was reelected every time, but...
Well, yeah, I'm all down. You still need the elections, but there should be no term limits. Look, it is so rare to get an actually good leader that when you get one, Jesus Christ, they ought to stay there for as long as they do well.
Right. There's no guarantee that a person elected for 5 times in a row, if we're talking 4-term or for 4-year terms, would necessarily be in the positive force, but you have to have some sort of consistency within a state, or it just doesn't work.
Yeah. No, the argument that
well,
the qualification is you according to the lawfulness of the land, or what is good or just, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, term limits are arbitrary. It's just insofar as you embody that the best, you should be there.
Right.
Yep. Continuing. In light of all this, it would appear that the nature of the just constitution is firmly and concretely rooted in the natural law which is sovereign over ruler and subject alike. Thus, what alone remains undone for justice to be securely grounded and defined would be specifying the content of that natural law itself. Yet, as Aristotle properly observes, the just constitution is not simply a matter of law. It is rather a regime of justice that must contain the privileged natural law together with actual obedience to it. Only when both are at hand can praxis be said to exist. This means that the metaphysics of justice must not only determine what is valid natural law, but what other features the Constitution must have to be a regime of proper obedience. So, this is why the state has the right to educate the citizens and determine the ideology. How else would it attain such a goal? In this regard, Aristotle seeks to temper what is best in an unqualified way with what is actually feasible. On the assumption that the best are few, it may well follow that the best constitution is aristocracy. However, political stability rests to some degree upon the consent of the citizens who are not among these few best. Consequently, unless they simply agree to be ruled by the best, the realization of justice may require incorporating some sort of democratic body within aristocracy. Similarly, care must be taken with regard to the distribution of wealth in society to prevent the many from feeling at odds with their rulers. Aristotle, that social democratic commie.
Aristotle socked him.
He's writing to the the rich men of Athens at this point.
All these considerations, however, sorry, what?
When he's writing the politics, it's not for the peasants or whatever.
The peasants couldn't fucking read.
Sorry.
All these considerations, however, make sense only if the unqualified best constitution is already determined as a standard by which to judge what regime is best when possible in any given situation. Aristotle's recourse to aristocracy is entirely formal, so long as all that can be said about the best is that they are thus most able to rule in accord with the privileged natural law that eludes specification. When he attempts to spell out the functions of the ideal aristocratic state in terms not entirely foreign to Plato's Republic, his specification of those functions and who should fulfill them still does not guarantee justice. Allotting farming and arts and crafts to a subordinate class, while assigning full-fledged citizenry to a leisured class whose young take care of military matters, whose middle-aged undertake the deliberations of government, and whose old minister to religion, may provide the conditions for the good life, but this does not prevent individuals from occupying their posts without doing what is right by nature. Once again, the content of natural law remains a separate factor that is not intrinsically contained within the activities that should be its instrument. Similarly, when Aristotle discusses the division of political powers and the concrete ways in which regimes may change from one form to another, none of the elements he describes guarantees the normative validity of the state. No matter how political functions are ordered and how arrangements of wealth and equality are handled, the common interest of goodness may still go unattended, as the abiding distinction of legitimate and illegitimate regimes testifies. All these elements still need to conform to some separate given nature, which makes them just only once embodied. Perhaps the most acute example of this ineradicable formality is found in Aristotle's recourse to the paragon of an absolutely good man. Wasn't that Pericles?
Oh, yeah. The founder of democracy in Athens, Pericles.
Who founded it by being an elected tyrant, a dictator, to fix shit. And then he actually abdicated and gave power back to the people.
Right. Look where it got them.
Well, look where he got them. He fixed the problems.
Yeah.
They ruined it. Such an individual would have to be... what?
Yeah, he didn't have Socrates killed. He didn't have Aristotle almost killed.
Indeed. Such an individual would have to be a law unto himself, for he would be the perfect embodiment of self-sufficient goodness, so qualitatively superior to others that the only role he could play in a political community would be that of a permanent monarch. Yet precisely by being a law unto himself, this absolutely good man would overthrow the sovereignty of law and replace a system of justice resting on privileged givens with one resting on a privileged determiner. Although Aristotle elsewhere describes the absolutely good man as equal to the citizen of the best state who holds the office of ruler, concealing the radical transformation of politics wrought by the introduction of realized goodness, the anomaly of the absolutely good man gives direct expression to the logical dilemma of the metaphysics of justice. Yeah, but that seems logical to me. That, I mean, if you're the best of the best, you're better than the fucking dead Constitution, which is the fucking formal piece of paper, a law.
Yeah.
Whereas you're alive, and you get to change things as they must be changed and done in real time. So it makes sense that this person would be above the law. I mean, they are the embodied good itself.
They're Nixon. If the president does it, it's not bad. It's legal.
Yep. And I mean, this is a common notion that we have, right? In which, like, we do think that there are people who are truly good, and that the things that they do are above, they do because they know the good and they're acting on the good, which is above the law.
Yeah, you trust their judgment rather than say, well, he must have had a good reason for it or something. I don't know. I know what you mean, but I can't think of anyone. I know there are a lot of people who think that there are people who are doing the absolute good, that are, they're just deceived.
Well, I think like Martin Luther King Jr. is a pretty good example of, someone that most people nowadays certainly see as having rightfully been above the law.
Yeah. Yeah, true. I guess I was just trying to think of more contemporary examples.
Oh, I can't think of anybody contemporary.
Yeah.
The final problem is this. So long as justice is taken to lie in the embodiment of some privilege given, the activities realizing that prescribed form of goodness can never exhibit in their own independent nature the given content that is supposed to lend them legitimacy. For justice to possess the unconditioned universality that validity demands, it must, however, consist in action that is an end in itself. Yet such an action cannot be an instrument for the realization of the independently given ends, since that would cancel its constitutive character as activity for its own sake. The example of the absolutely good man brings this contradiction to a head for the reason that such an individual could not be subject to any external prescriptions without ceasing to be a paragon in his own right. I guess to reiterate on that, so the state up to that point has to give the good as a given end, despite its profession of that the good is the activity of politics. But no individual embodies that alone. But supposing that you have an individual that actually embodies the good truly and fully, this individual embodies the good more than the constitution of the state as a whole does. Because his activity is his own end, rather than the it's not that his end is the activity of the state, but his end is his own activity as the activity of the good. So by the very logic that we've been following, he must be above the law. He must be above the state. Because that which determines is higher than that which is determined. And the state first determines, and that's why it is highest, but it is determined insofar as it has to be produced by the citizenry actively, by choice. But when a person fully embodies this, they lose that relationship of having the state as their own end, because they now are the good. Their activity is the good in itself. The problem faced by the metaphysics of justice is thus identical to the dilemma afflicting the metaphysics of truth. Just as no privilege given can ground itself as a first principle of reason or reality, so no privilege given can possibly stand as the prescribed rule for justice. Not only can no natural law be defended without appealing to a higher given principle in need of like justification, but the content of justice can never be an embodiment of antecedently determined forms without losing the intrinsic validity it requires. Nothing shows this more visibly than the highest point of praxis, the apex of rule, where, be it in Plato's Republic or Aristotle's ideal state, those who govern exercise and activity is ultimately subject only to whatever standards it gives itself. Aristotle's inability to ever inability ever to discover the privileged nature of justice given the relations of political activity only testifies to the inner contradiction of praxis. Action cannot be both something for its own sake and the embodiment of independently given ends, any more than there can be foundations of reason or reality that are both irreducibly given and self-grounding. As the internal collapse of the metaphysical approach makes clear, the recourse to privileged givens must be abandoned if the quest for truth and justice are to meet success. Alright, and that finishes the chapter. I think that's a pretty solid argument. Went over the rudimentary beginnings of the theory, shows why, what's posited by the theory, what is required by it, and then shows how it cannot ultimately achieve its own aims of providing the justification that it wants to provide. There's always a gap here. For Plato, the rulers cannot escape ruling themselves while ruling other people. And Plato has no answer to that reflex. For Aristotle, the same thing. He sees the problem, he tries to dodge it by going, okay, it's going to be both something given, but also something that is actively done. But you can't have it as given and actively done at the same time, cannot be both something for its own sake, the activity, and the embodiment of independently given ends, any more than there can be foundations of reason or reality that are both irreducibly given and self-grounding. So you cannot have the natural law, because which will be the end in itself of the state, which will determine all else, including the people within it. All individuals must obey that law, the Constitution. But then that makes their practice merely a relative praxis, towards that end, such that they are the ones determining that end's reality in the world. But then that makes the Constitution itself not really the end in itself, truly, because the action is the one that makes the effect, the artifact. Therefore, somebody who actually embodies the good is the only one who can actually bring this to bear at the level of full reality, to the extent that they can. But then their action is directly that good, the truth. It is the end in itself, but then it breaks the entire state apart, because now this individual is the good in itself and then can be the one that determines everything else, including themselves. But then we still lack a principle of how are you supposed to determine yourself, and what are those ends that you're supposed to determine. I think this is a really masterful argument, showing that for all the complexity that we got out of this, ultimately it's grounded upon nothing. Ultimately we can give no justifications for that. I don't know. What do you think, Rain?
Pretty good summary. You see what Winfield's solutions are. See where he takes us.
This has a long way to go to the solutions. This is very exhaustive of the main political and ethical currents in philosophical history, particularly of the West. It's a very good book. Anyways.
Yeah, chapter 3 is on the transcendental.
So this was the attack on the metaphysical, the failure of the metaphysical to achieve the determination of what justice truly is. So then the metaphysical, the ontological approach fails. The next option has to be the fundamental epistemological form, which is fundamentally only one person in the West, Kant. Kant is the other one who begins with epistemology first and then determines the ontology through that. So anyways, for those of you listening, hopefully you found this interesting. See you around.
Later.